All right, let's get started. So thank you everyone for attending our panels. This is the last panel, Equity in Architecture, the Future of the Profession. We have a great panel for you today as well. I'm very excited to introduce some oldies and some newbies. I'm Lauren Harris. I'm your 2020 Regional Associate Director on the National Associates Council. I'm also Chair of Women in Architecture. We also have with us Andrew Thompson. Andrew, would you like to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thanks, Lauren. So I'm the county architect for Passaic County. I'm also president of the AIA Newark and Suburban chapter for the year 2020. Section of AIA New Jersey for 2020, and was a professor at Pratt from 1995-2000, and also been a longtime member of NOMA and served on their board for a number of years. Thank you.
Thanks. It's always good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We also have Lori Ann Jones. Lori Ann is a project manager at DI Group Architecture. That is an MBE firm. This is the first time that we have an employee and an employer on the panel together. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that. I think it's a great opportunity to kind of hear both sides of the equation. Lori Ann, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Glad to be back for this final panel. This issue I feel strongly about, and one of my big passions to further the profession has been through mentoring. I'm currently on the board of ACE New Jersey and a team leader and a mentor, and I'm also the 2020 president of AIA Central New Jersey.
Well, Lori Ann, thank you so much for spending all this time with us. We also have Bill Moses. Bill comes to us from Gensler. He also comes to us from NOMA. So we're so excited to have Bill with us, or Will or William. It depends all the time. We keep switching our names. So you tell us, what do you like best?
I just like Will.
Will. Okay. So we're going to go with Will tonight. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi. My name is Will Moses. I am a past board member of NICOBA NOMA, and also current president of the New Jersey chapter of NOMA. I've done tons of mentorships with the NAACP, as well as at NJIT, which is my alma mater. Yes, hey. And I'm currently with Gensler, and I love architecture, and I love helping people navigate their way through architecture, especially young students and young minority students as well.
Well, thank you, Will, for being with us and spending all this time with us over the last few weeks. We also have Bill Brown. Bill is the former president of AIA Newark and Suburban, AIA New Jersey, and New Jersey NOMA. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I held those positions, and I also work for Hudson County Engineering, and I have my own practice. I'm just been nominated for the AXO chair for the Maplewood Oranges branch of the NAACP, and I serve as an architectural mentor for the young people there, not only in my branch, but throughout the state. So any kid interested in architecture, I'm there to help them. And I just conducted the a Zoom architectural course, Introduction to Architecture, which was very successful, and I'm happy to have done that and help the kids along and know a little bit about architecture. So I'm going to do it again, just trying to find some time, but it's been very inspirational for me as well as the young people.
Well, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you so much for spending all this time with us. I think it has been very valuable for us. Thank you. Our next guest is Stacy Rule-Cleash. Stacy is the chair of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here in New Jersey. Stacy also holds quite a few positions here in New Jersey. Stacy, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me again tonight, Lauren. My name is Stacy Rule-Cleash. I am a sole practitioner. I do a lot of mentoring with young women who are looking to launch their own firms or make a strategic change in the position that they are in currently in their firm. I am a past president of AIA New Jersey and the Architects League of Northern New Jersey, And I'm very passionate about the fact that we cannot relate to everybody else's experience based on our own experience. So we have to keep our eyes and ears open to understand what other people are feeling and going through, and then make connections with them based on what their feelings and experience are. And that's why this really means a lot to me to participate in the equity conversation. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being with us and for all of the positions that you do at AIA New Jersey, because there are so many. It's like a full-time job. Joining us new to this panel today is Vincent Myers, the president of DI Group Architecture. And I said earlier that Lori Ann is the employee and Vincent is the employer. So I think this is going to be a really interesting relationship, and we might tap into this a little bit in the panel tonight. Vincent, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, you can, I go by Vince.
Vince,
And,
okay.
Very humbled to be a part of this incredible panel, talking about something that is near and dear, certainly to my heart. And yes, although I don't describe myself as, I'm the president of DI Group Architecture, and certainly proud to have, Lori Ann as part of the firm. We actually met many years ago, probably 12 or 13 years ago, through the ACE program, which is a passion of mine. I ran through the firm, went to East Orange, was sort of our ACE chapter, and teaching young people, many of whom are still in contact with me. And so that's what I would consider a legacy of mine, being involved with the ACE program, really with a hands-on approach and taking the time to meet with students and talk to them and get them excited about architecture. We opened up an office in Philadelphia about a year ago. And one of the things that we're committed to doing there, through the Rebuild program, which is all about equity and inclusion, is to, as we get projects, try to connect with the ACE program in Philadelphia, to try to bring in students as we develop projects there. I'm also, the one person I do know besides Lori Ann is Bill Brown. And my father, who is an architect, he no longer practices. However, he started his own firm in Princeton and was there for about 30 years. And through that relationship, I came to know Bill Brown Sr., Bill Brown Jr., or Bill Brown III, I should say. And I'm glad to see Bill, and I'm glad to be connected back with him again.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Vince.
Absolutely.
Okay, our last guest today is Dr. Kendall Nicholson. I know Dr. Nicholson, like we're on a first name basis, Kendall, but I'll call him Dr. Kendall tonight. How's that? I know Dr. Kendall through the National Associates Committee. He's in charge of the mentorship work group, but also he is the Director of Research and Information for the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, also known as the ACSA. Dr. Kendall, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Lauren. You can obviously just call me Kendall. And thanks for having me here. So I'm a transplant from Virginia, but as Lauren said, I'm on the National Associates Committee for AIA. I'm also serving as a member of AIA's Equity and the Future of Architecture Committee, which is specifically focuses on equity and making sure that AIA National is a little bit of a checks and balance for AIA National as far as moving the pen forward on equity and diversity. And then my background is actually, my expertise is in education. I have a doctorate in education, so I'm always looking at architecture and its issues and successes from a social scientist standpoint. So thanks a lot for having me, and I'm excited for the conversation tonight.
Well, thank you so much for being here. The reason why I invited Kendall to be part of our panel is he wrote an incredible article called "Where Are My People? Black in Architecture." So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to give Kendall the floor so he can tell us a little bit about his research and his thought process. And then we'll open the panel to discussion, not just about his scholarly article, but also about the future of the profession. We've been together 12 weeks now, and I'm sure we have a lot of thoughts and we've gained a lot of knowledge. So we're all here to kind of figure out where we go from here. So Kendall, take it away.
All right, I'm gonna try to share my screen here, and I'm gonna try to stick to about 15 minutes, so knowing that we can obviously have a lot of discussion after the fact. Sorry, give me, just do that. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. So again, thanks for the invitation to come and talk. I'm just gonna really quickly run through equity, diversity, and inclusion, racial discrimination in that article in particular, and how it relates to architecture. One of the questions that, or one of the issues I see in equity and diversity and inclusion in particular is the conflation of these terms. So I promise I'm going to talk about the article, but I think it's really important for us to all have some shared language. And so you see organizations and institutions, and in my case, I see schools of architecture, use these terms interchangeably. And I think it's really important to point out that equity is going to be the goal. Now people say justice and equity, and I would include the J on that, but that equity and justice are going to recognize the history and systems. Diversity, inclusion, and even cultural competence don't necessarily recognize the history and systems that have put us where we are today. So diversity, I think diversity is great. It's diversity, inclusion, cultural competence, none of them are bad things, but in and of themselves, they don't actually solve the issue. So diversity is really about awareness and appreciation, knowing that we have people from different backgrounds, with different gender identities, with differences, and that we can appreciate and have some interchange there. Much like cultural competence. Cultural competence is specifically about individual interactions, right? So I, as a person, might talk to Lauren, and I should be aware of where she comes from. I'm talking to her, and so, to not be offensive, and that we can all, live harmoniously. And then inclusion, I've become a lot more cynical of over the past year or two. Inclusion says everyone is welcome. And like I said, in and of itself is a great thing. But as I said, I'm a transplant from Virginia here, and currently live in Central Virginia. So inclusion would be like saying, or sometimes like saying, if I were to say to you, you guys, hey, everyone on this call, it's 7:13 where I am, everyone on this call is invited to a drink at the local bar at 9:30. Well, I could call the bar, I could make a reservation, tell them that we have 40 people that are coming, but realistically, and I could really mean it, I hope you all come, but realistically, it's not realistic for you all to come. I haven't asked where anyone's traveling from. I haven't asked about what kind of drinks you might like, or what kind of hors d'oeuvres you do or don't like. And so that inclusion piece sometimes has a faulty foundation, if I can use an architecture analogy, because it says everyone's welcome, and it can be well-intended, but if you don't actually ask and set up systems for people to succeed, then all you've done is serve them, a smile and said, you can come if you can make it here. One of the things I think about often is, or when I talk to schools in particular, I always kind of echo the idea that we should be trying to pull out the barriers, not trying to see how well people can jump the hurdles, right? And I'm sure many of us have experienced jumping some of those hurdles. So again, really quickly, racism, which I'll talk about because I'm going to talk specifically about Black in architecture. Racism, I have the definition here. It's really about the system, not about an interpersonal interaction. And that system is built solely on physical criteria or physical characteristics. So skin color, hair texture, facial features, etc. That's different than racial identity. If I were to tell you I was mixed race, which I'm not, I'm Black, but if I were to tell you I was mixed race and I looked exactly the same, my racial identity might be different, but I will be raced and read as a Black person. You know, if I'm in the car driving, if I'm at TSA, if I, you know, if I say, if I were to go in a grocery store, trip and fall on my face, someone would say, that Black man just fell and fell on his face. They wouldn't be so concerned about my complete racial identity or makeup. I'm gonna skip some of this for the interest of time. And I'll just touch really quickly on white privilege because I think that's an important piece. Again, it's about the system of advantage based on being white. And again, that racial identity is not necessarily, this is irregardless of racial identity. So someone could be Hispanic or Latinx, but if they present as white, if most people would perceive them as white, then they'll experience some of that white privilege. Interestingly enough, Lauren, I'm finalizing Where Are My People, Hispanic and Latinx in Architecture, which should come out tomorrow, so you all can be on the lookout for that. I'm gonna skip some of these examples and get to some of the graphics for the article. So as I just mentioned, Where Are My People is the larger series. And what I did is I started with African American and Black because that's what I personally knew the most. And so I'm essentially going through a number of characterizations or ways in which people might actually champion diversity, and making sure we're keeping the main thing, as my mom would say. So this graphic in particular is about Black men. I have a picture here from the chain gangs in Georgia. And so I'm calling attention to architectural admissions, right? Because schools will say, we need to go to HBCUs and recruit more Black men and women, people of color, indigenous people. But for Black men in particular, the recruitment piece, while it's important and should be paid attention to, that's not the whole of the issue. The larger issue is actually that almost a third of the sentenced prison population is Black men. This is including men and women. And so you have these grave disparities with the number of Black men that are arrested, and it goes back, I mean, again, I said equity is always going to point to the history and systems, right? So the history and systems start with slavery, obviously, and the lack of rights for Blacks in general. Then moves to the Reconstruction period. We have peonage that was really large in Texas. You have these, you have all these series of, during that period, you have a series of laws and legislation and essentially just rounding up Black men in particular for doing nothing, for loitering. You could be imprisoned. For, I think it's in Louisiana, there was a law that said you could be arrested for looking a white woman in the eye as a Black man. And so you have all of these systems that are no longer in our present, but that have grabbed hold of how we look at people, how we interact with people across the country. This graphic was in particular for Black women, just noting that Black women make up 1 out of every 3 Black architecture students. So approximately a third of the architecture students that identify as Black also identify as female. But that's really in reverse or in contrast to the larger Black population in higher education. So in higher education, almost 2/3 of the Black students that are enrolled in colleges and universities across the country are women. So ideally, we'd expect to see that same 2/3 actually in the architecture profession, if not a 50-50 parity. And then women make up 1 out of every 5 licensed Black architects. There's a lot happening on the front of Black women Tiffany Brown from NOMA National has the 400 Forward. And I'm sure if any of you involved with NOMA, I serve as NOMA Virginia's treasurer. We just got founded, our chapter just got founded a week or two ago. So anyway, there's a large push for Black women, moving it from 400 to 800 or doubling that number in some way, shape, or form. This was a look at the role of HBCUs, and I found the same thing for HSIs, which stands for Hispanic Serving Institutions. That'll come out tomorrow. But of the 139 NAB accredited programs, 7 of them are historically Black colleges, or universities. And those 7 schools, which is such a small percent of the 139, make up almost 1/3 of the Black architecture student population. And so that means that the average architecture school is only graduating like 2 Black students every year in their NAB accredited program. And so I have this picture here from Tuskegee's. Tuskegee has a rich history of trying to be self-sufficient and having the Black architecture students actually build a number of the buildings on campus, which I'm always quite fond of. Next, I took a look at the difference between pre-professional enrollment and accredited enrollment. And what I found is that on the whole, Black or African-American students were more likely to be enrolled in a pre-professional program than they were to be enrolled in an accredited program. So those accredited programs are the Bachelor of Architecture, Masters of Architecture, or a Doctor of Architecture at University of Hawaii, Manoa. And so you see the converse for white or Caucasian students, where the majority of their enrollment is actually in accredited programs. And so there's a little bit that needs to happen on that front, where we're pushing, if students know they want to become licensed architects, that we are able to set them up in a way that they know which program they're going into, they have a very clear path, etc. This graphic is about the Black faculty in architecture. You can see there are way too many schools with no Black faculty. This was, I can't say it was astonishing because I've been through architecture schools, so I understand that is not a common experience unless you're at a HBCU or in an urban environment. I think sometimes they have better success or do a better job at hiring Black faculty. But you'll also see that the percent of Black deans, Black full-time faculty, Black tenured faculty, and even adjuncts is all well below 5%. And for the past 10 years, the National Architectural Accrediting Board, NAB, has tracked the number and the percent of Black students in architectural education, and it's hovered at 5% and continues to hover at 5%. I think I have 2 more slides here. This one's a little bit hard to see, but I made a comparison of the percent of Black people who identify as Black that work in architecture. So it could be licensed architects, could be people just working at firms. On the whole, the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates that 6.3% of the architecture workforce would identify as Black. And that's compared to a number of different occupations that the Harris Poll considers as prestigious occupations. So I'll just read them because I know they're kind of hard to see. Doctors #1, scientists is #2, firefighters #3, a military officer, engineers #5, nurse, then architect, which is in that pinkish red, EMT, veterinarian. There are no Black veterinarians, and that's also a common known thing. A police officer, teacher, chief executive, a chef, an athlete, and a lawyer. So again, I'll put the link in the chat if I can. I'm assuming I can, and we can look at that later. But the percent of Black people or people who identify as Black in the United States is 13%. And so that's what you see, that line there. I mean, there are a number of the prestigious, what's considered prestigious occupations that don't meet that mark. The only two being chef and military officer. And then I included a picture of these two sharecroppers, because I often think when I talk about Blackness in America, for one, but also talk about equity and the reallocation of resources, I often think that there were millions of Black laborers, enslaved people, with great potential that were not able to do. I mean, we would have a number of Black doctors, Black scientists, Black firefighters, Black veterinarians, Black opera singers, I mean, I could go on and on. If the people that were pigeonholed and oppressed to a specific way of life and labor were actually able to sustain themselves to be great. And then lastly, I have this really quick, it was a really easy analysis of the 360 honors that are awarded between AIA and ACSA in identifying those who identified as Black. And so we have Thomas Fowler, who's out in California. We have Sharon Sutton, who is now at Parsons, a professor emerita from University of Washington, and then Paul Revere Williams. And so for the interest of time, I'll stop there, Lauren, and I have some additional notes if people are interested or if the topic comes up. But I'll stop there and pass it back to you.
Well, thank you so much. I know I just learned an enormous amount of information, and I also read your article. I just feel that having you explain it in real depth, I'm just getting more and more information that I certainly did not know before. I don't know, but does the panel want to make some initial comments on what they just learned?
Or what many of you might have already known,
right.
too. But
you know, I thought it was very helpful. I did read. I share Lauren's comments that I did read the article, but it was definitely helpful for me just to hear, have you go through it and talk about it. It has a different effect and a different meaning to me, so I do appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us. So over the last 12 weeks that we've spent together, we talked about how do we attract people at the K-12 level to architecture. And we were able to have John Henry from the New Jersey School Board Association with us. And he agreed to allow us to put together a portfolio package so that we can go directly to every guidance counselor in the state of New Jersey and let them know that if you're steering your students towards an architecture program, please steer them to an accredited program. Don't let them waste that time in an unaccredited program, which means real dollars and real time away from them having a career in architecture. I do want to let the panel know that we have begun putting together a committee. We have a bunch of volunteers. So one of the things that we will be doing in the next few months is putting together that portfolio package for the New Jersey School Board Association. So
if I could just interrupt real quickly, that's a great idea. And I was thinking about that in the context of the ACE program, because many of the students that are getting ready, you know, high school students that are either freshmen, sophomores, juniors, et cetera, and getting ready, that's an audience that at least has a real interest in, you know, taking the next steps. And many of them I've found, you know, lack that information. And so that's a great idea, because sharing that information with those students could be extremely helpful.
Yeah. One of the things I found by I taught 1 year at Essex County College, but what I found is the kids don't understand it's not an accredited program. NJIT is the only accredited program in the state of New Jersey. And a lot of kids go to the community colleges and they're not aware that some of their credits may not be acceptable. So they waste a lot of time and money. A lot of them work during the day and go to school at night. So when they find out, they have to either go get some work experience or take additional courses, and it's really not fair that they have to spend extra money and not realizing that those courses are not accredited or they won't be accepted at an accredited school. NJIT can't take up the whole state. I mean, you got maybe 1,000 some odd kids are interested in architecture, but you either had to go out of state or create some inconvenience for particularly for minority students.
So Kendall, you had a question?
Yeah, well, I just had a comment, and I don't mean to interrupt the flow too much, Lauren, but I think it's interesting because to Vince's point, I often ask people. I talk to people, all over the country because I am working with these different schools, and in regards to preparing students for architecture, I often ask people, architects, how would your grandmother define architecture? And it's a question that instantly points to the social relevancy of architects, right? Like we talk a lot about our value, and I'm going to include myself, even though I'm not a licensed architect, but the discipline talks a lot about our value, and it's important that we're able to communicate that value to the public. If your grandmother or grandfather can't define what an architect is and you work in architecture, I think that's a problem that we can only kind of point to ourselves and say, why is it that no one can tell us what we do except for ourselves? To your earlier point about creating a portfolio, I just wanted to let you guys know that the collaterals have come together to do some version of that. So before you get too far down, we just invited NOMA to that table, but previously it was the ACSA, AIA, NCARB actually led the charge for this, and NAB, and we got together, essentially created a pamphlet that's geared specifically to school counselors, and the plan was actually to take it to the National Association of School Counselors convention in July, but that didn't happen. So it's in the final stages of being finalized, and it has input from everybody. Might be something else just to add to that packet to send out. It's digital. It'll be digital, so it can be sent out that way.
So to the panel, knowing that we need to create a future of architects that includes a pathway to architecture, starting from the beginning, what else do you think that we should be doing at the AIA or at NOMA to entice people to join this profession and to, as Kendall put it, pull out the barriers instead of seeing if people can jump over the hurdles?
Well, you have to really go into the communities and talk to the students. I think early on, before I was really heavy into AIA, was a part of NOMA's New York chapter, and we used to do a lot of work in Harlem and in Brooklyn. And I think just the time just doing outreach with those young kids, trying to let them know that there was a pathway in this field called architecture. We would bring drawings, we'd bring sometimes models of our homes, or even some schoolwork that we had done in the past to show the kids what architecture school is like, and try to get someone hooked. And then furthermore, before I really became involved with AIA, with NOMA, in the early parts, we did what we call Project Pipeline, where we did these camps with kids and set them up, and did projects based on a whole week course of just really immersing them in the field of architecture. And then when I really got involved with AIA New Jersey, in doing the K through 12 with my treasurer, John Fallon, we went out to Newark and did the outreach there in the city of Newark to introduce these young kids and these high school kids to, the power of architecture. And I think right now, the premise that people should know is with everything that's going on with our communities and what we see on the news every day and what's happening, to let these young kids know that they have the power to change their community. And one thing I can tell you growing up, I grew up in Brooklyn. I didn't grow up in Jersey. And I grew up in a neighborhood that was affected by the crack epidemic, by heroin. And, you know, when I saw burnt out buildings and vacant lots, my thing was, you know, how could I make my community better? What was my impact? And in high school, you know, there was a shop class where I actually had to build a house. And that's when my calling was there. I said, okay, this is how you make the change. Go into the field of architecture, become an architect, and you can come back to your community and make an impact.
I think each one of us are ambassadors for the profession, and really have to go out and start young. Years ago, I went to St. Philip's Academy. I started when Legos first came out. I went into school on Saturday mornings and developed workshops for the kids, but we have to try to make it fun for the kids and teach them. But each of us can play a major part in the development and the upgrading for the profession. So I'd say that each one of us has different gifts and talent that we can go into the schools and go into communities and try to make a difference for the kids and make it fun for the kids and get them interested in the profession.
I described it earlier. Lorianne and I have had some really great discussions about, you know, exposure. And so I was really interested to hear Andrew's story about how he got started. And I know a little bit about Bill and how he got started. You know, his father's an architect. My father's an architect. And, you know, and I was exposed to architecture at a very, very young age. And, you know, and I got to learn about all the things that, you know, that go into the profession and learned about it. But it was at a very young age. I was, you know, I'd see my father working and drawing, and it always amazed me, you know. I think, you know, he's a unique individual in that, you know, I don't know how he was really exposed to architecture beyond, you know, he saw some drawings and the bug caught him. And, you know, and for an African-American man, you know, back in, you know, the 50s and 60s, you know, how he just somehow or another figured out that that's what he wanted to do. But not everybody is like that. And, you know, so to many of the points being mentioned today by Andrew and by Bill, that, and I mentioned this to Lorianne, that, you know, exposing younger people to architecture from people that look like them, you know, is so powerful and so important, and, you know, and can really go a long way. It doesn't solve many of the problems that structurally that the doctor talked about, but it does connect with them in a way that, you know, now they see it and they get it, and it can be a very powerful thing.
I kind of refer to it as the playground test. So, you know, kids know on the playground, know what a firefighter is, a cop, you know, a doctor. It's got to get to the point where a kid knows, you know, like a preschooler knows what an architect is. And just even if it's a kind of very caricature kind of way, it still needs to be brought as part of our culture a little bit stronger, what an architect is from that very early age. Because that's where it comes from. We talked about all of the barriers that happen along the way, but I think one of our biggest impacts is being able to have a bigger catchment area of people who are going through the steps and hopefully making it out in bigger numbers. And one of the things we even talk about in ACE is that even if someone doesn't follow the path to become an architect, we've created that awareness, because if they're not an architect in one of us, hopefully they're one of our clients. Hopefully there's somebody who appreciates architecture and is trying to get architects to work on projects. So that's a big area of growth that we can focus on, because it's within our own power to be able to go out and do that.
So in our very first panel, we talked about, if I can't see it, I can't achieve it. And we talked a lot about TV and movies and how they don't portray architects either not at all or not in a good light, but they certainly don't portray many architects of color. So what is the highest and best use of that? Should architects be lobbying Hollywood and saying to Hollywood, you stop portraying us on HGTV and start portraying us in sitcoms or in a light and happy way so that people can see that people of color are excellent architects and it is a fun profession and it is inspirational. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the first movie I saw years ago, actually my grandfather had introduced me to it. It was, I think it came on sometime at night, and it was a Fountainhead. And my grandfather said, you know, you should sit down and watch this movie. It's really different. It's about an architect. So I'm like, what am I gonna, it's a black and white movie. It looks old. I mean, I don't want to sit and watch 2 hours of this. But, you know, I sat and I watched it and I'm like, wow. I said, really, this is some story. And I remember years later, when I think I was just out of college and Jungle Fever came out and, you know, Spike Lee made this movie and he had actually a person who was the consultant on the movie who I had met just a couple of years before, Jack Travis. So here I was watching this movie on the big screen, and there is, you know, somebody I knew, Jack Travis, who contributed to the look and feel of the movie. Now I know there were a lot of celebrities about, you know, what architects do, and there was another backstory to it. But the fact that we saw a black man in an office pointing to the work that he had done really kind of started to solidify that Hollywood was making steps to kind of put this out there, even though if it was that one time.
I want to go back to what Lori Ann was saying and answer this question. I think going young is really important. I think it's also impactful to go to high school. I used to teach middle and high schoolers. But I always say that when you go low, you go like, you know, early elementary, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, preschoolers, you're able to feed two birds with one scone, right? Like you're able to educate kids, much like you know, the anti-smoking campaign or forest fires, right? I'm sure I can't be the only one on the call that had Smokey the Bear come to their school and say, you too can prevent forest fires. So if you go that low and actually put some money behind it, then kids will go home and they'll say, Mom, Dad, this is what I learned today. And so you're educating the youth, you're educating the parent. And I think then the problem kind of becomes, how do we make it relatable, right? So I think one of the obstacles, in addition to not actually seeing architects in your spaces, not knowing architects, like Lori Ann said, everyone has seen a firefighter or a fire station, or you know, they've been to the doctor. I think Hollywood, so to speak, could play a role in presenting. Can you imagine what it might look like if there was even a racially ambiguous architect on Nick Jr., right? Like something that like had it, and kids would buy this little thing and it would be, you know, overpriced. And I mean, but that's the kind of synergy that we need to pull design to people. Now what I was going to say is we got to make it relatable and reachable, right? Like, so if we still are only doing projects that are commercial or that are for affluent communities, then we haven't really tied it back to their lived experience.
Those are some great thoughts. So a lot of times we do brush on some difficult topics. So I'm going to ask you a question. I was talking to some of the leadership, and I do go to schools in Philadelphia and Trenton and Camden and Newark, and I do summer camps and other things like that, bringing these programs to inner city schools or impoverished communities. And I told them recently I was having issues with it because the pipeline, like, am I introducing them to a pipeline that is going to be a terrible hardship for them? Am I inspiring them to be part of a community that isn't welcoming to them? Do you think that we should be spending our time fixing the system before we bring more people into it?
I say no. I think it's important that, you know, and again, I bring up examples of pioneers in the field, and, you know, inspiration is inspiration. And as difficult as times are now, they were more difficult many, many years ago. But people, our predecessors in the field, African American men and women, and even, you know, and I'm also speaking to Lorianne and her parents and grandparents. And, you know, it's all about inspiration and, you know, getting people inspired to do something that they could potentially fall in love with and really embrace. And, you know, that's, to me, that's part of somebody's spirit. And that's something that gets somebody motivated to do something. And when you get people motivated to do something that they really like and really are passionate about, then they become ambassadors to their pursuits. And everyone on this panel, I think, has a great story about inspiration and about spirit. And I think that that always has to be the driving force. That always has to be what people, how we talk to people and how we get them inspired. And yes, we still have to fix those other structural things for sure. But just getting people excited about it, getting young people excited about the profession is, I think, something that can't wait for us to fix problems that are going to probably take a while to fix.
I'll say start early myself, because it may come up, like Vince was saying, they're inspired, but it may come up with some new ideas that we don't even think about. So I would say don't wait. Let's, you know, inspire the kids and about the profession, and they'll come up with something during their present age to make a difference in the world.
I also think that every time we go into a classroom, Lauren, or we go into a program with one of these children's groups like you and I do so often, we are making connections on those days that can flourish and grow. So I know, for example, sometimes people will present me with a problem that's not something specific, but saying, you know, how can we solve this giant systematic issue, Stacy? You know, can I dump this on your lap and you can solve it? And no, chances are I'm not personally going to be able to solve that. But if somebody says, hey, Stacy, this child is interested in what you're talking about, would you take their hand and walk them through it? And I will always say, yes, I will take that child's hand and I will lead them. And not just today while I'm here, but here's my contact information. Let me email their parent. Let me contact them during the year and let them know other things that are going on. And, you know, that might only be a tiny pebble in the big picture of solving the problem, but it's something that every one of us on this call is devoted to, because that's why we're participating. And we each can take a hand and lift that person up. So I would say absolutely we should continue spreading the word, sharing the message, and taking a hand.
Let me just say really quickly, and I'll open it up for someone else to speak, because I'm doing a lot of talking. But I think it's a catch-22, because I know in my own experience as a Black man, it's always been clear that the road will be difficult. It really didn't matter whether I was going to architecture, whether I was going to become a doctor, whether I was going to be an attorney, whether I was going to be a chef. It didn't matter. So I think, unfortunately, there's this desensitization, right, to this idea that no matter where I go, I'm going to have to work a little bit harder. You know, I'm going to have to consider things that maybe other people don't need to consider. So for that reason, I would say we can't wait. But I will say, as I stated in the presentation, that recruiting students without looking at the system, like they have to be done in tandem, because if you recruit the students without looking at the system, then you've committed, you know, that inclusion fraud, right? Like that you can come, I want you to come, or schools, not you in particular, Lauren, Stacy, but schools have, committed this heinous act that says, okay, we're going to open up, we're going to let a few extra students of color in. Good luck. Like, well, that's not going to be enough to get them to the end.
No, that's true. And one of the, so that's a great point. And I can only relate it to experiences. And I think, and I keep referring to the ACE program just as one example, but it's about pathway, it's about that portfolio that Lauren spoke about. And it's about, truth as well. And it's about, in the ACE program, what I thought was really valuable there was you're actually connecting professionals to students so that they knew when they went through the ACE program, they had a friend, they had somebody, they knew somebody, somebody that could mentor them, somebody that they could ask questions if they had questions about when they were in school, when they got out of school. At least there was, hey, if I can't hire you, I can reach out on somebody else's behalf to get you, get that pathway. And that's, that's really important as well.
Can I interject real quick? I just want to say that I've met with a lot of students that wanted to do architecture in the beginning, and they got discouraged or they found other pathways because they needed to sort of get out of school. They didn't want to go to the 5-year courses. They wanted to take the 4-year courses and then go into construction management where they can create more money, more income for themselves versus architecture. And what I find with the profession is that it's not a easy profession. And when a lot of people that are interested in the beginning enter the profession, as they go along their path, they feel like, or they may see other options and may opt to take those as well, because as a student who actually went to a community college first before he went to a 5-year course at NJIT, I found it so that I had to work. So I had to sort of make money and think about making money, as much money as I can, and and worry about becoming an architect later on down the line. So when those factors come into play, what would be our role in order to assist someone? Because there's and to keep them on the right path, because there's, as you grow in life, there's you have to take care of your family. You may have a wife and kids, or there's other obstacles that may come into your path, and then you have to take care of those. And architecture is not, when you compare architecture to a sport like basketball, they would rather do basketball and get a scholarship. You can get a sports scholarship like that, but an architectural scholarship is hard to find. So the path is not as forgiving as other professions or other careers. So,
That's a great point.
And I think going to Will's point too, because Will and I go way back from when he was a student at NJIT. And when I was coming into the board of Nycoba Noma, I brought Will on my board to mentor him in a collective of architects that would sort of look to see his path where he was going forward and to make sure he was doing the right thing. I want to go back to Stacy's original point, is that the system does have problems. Okay, I didn't have an architect as a mentor, the guy to guide me where I had to go. Architecture school was very tough for me because I was from this neighborhood in Brooklyn. I was perceived to not have the skills or the sort of dialogue to kind of get myself through a critique or through a project. But I persevered and says, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to do. But it doesn't happen for everybody. So what I try to do in part of my career is do mentorship. So, you know, like William is one. I mean, there are a lot of other people that I've mentored over the years, either to get them through school or to get them into licensure. And that's the first thing that has to happen. Every person who's an architect, who's an architect of color, should make it their point to take one on and say, I'm going to mentor this young person to get them through whatever they have to get through to the profession, because it hasn't really changed much. There was an article in Architecture Record today about the City College of New York, City College of New York dean who just resigned, and she gave this list of things that happened in the school. I'm like, why am I reading this like it's 1991? You know, this still should not be happening. So there are parts of the system that must change. I think the dialogue that's going on right now is actually waking all schools of architecture up, what they need to do, how to work with their students, how to diversify their students. And I think, Lauren, I think one of the first conversations we had during the series is, you know, put the money where it matters. I mean, Pratt Institute, my alma mater, Ken Chenault and his wife donated $1 million to the School of Architecture for the premise of diversity. If every philanthropist could do that to one school of architecture for the premise of diversity, that's a systematic change.
I do also think that because of all of the challenges that people could face, it's even more important that we're in front of people, helping them get an awareness about the profession, and offering a hand early, so that they have an even better leg up than if they were going it alone.
Can
So
I just add
yeah, absolutely.
just really quickly, I think it's also important to think about the diversity of schools, right? So as you know, as Lauren said, I work for ACSA, which oversees all 147 architecture schools in the US and Canada. And so even in New Jersey alone, you have NJIT, you have Keene University, you have Princeton University, drastically different universities. And the experience of a person of color is going to be drastically different based on their own personal identity, how they identify among white people, how they, you know, there are a number of, their ability to code switch. There are a number of different environments that, and scenarios that would make those three schools drastically different. And so preparing the student to go, I'll use the schools in Virginia. There's the University of Virginia, there's Hampton University, there's Virginia Tech. Preparing much like Princeton, Keene, and NJIT, preparing them to go to the different environments is also a thing. I think for a lot of students of color, the experience that they have can be off-putting, which can put them somewhere else. Whereas if they had gone to a different school with a different support system, as Andrew said, a different level of interaction by people that look like them, they might have stayed the course.
Well, I mean, NJIT was not an all-black school, but it was in a black town, and I opted to go to that school as opposed to going to an HBCU. And I thought that would probably be the better way for me to go, as opposed to, you know, not being around people that are like me, because I wanted more of a diversity and a challenge as well. What would you say about something like that? If, you know, the person, you know, that was just my choice. I could have gone to an all-black college, but I decided not to.
Right. So I think, I mean, I went to the University of Virginia, which was a pre-professional program, largely white university, and went as one who was really fluent in white spaces. Like, I was very comfortable in white spaces, probably more comfortable then than I am now. But I say that to say, I think it's all about setting the expectation. Like, I had this expectation as a high school graduate. I graduated at the top of my class. I had this expectation and came from a fairly diverse school system here in Virginia. So I had this expectation that I would only be judged on my merit. And so when I got to the University of Virginia and had someone throw the N-word at me, then I realized that it didn't matter how smart, how articulate, how, you know, how well dressed or how poised I was. None of that mattered in that circumstance. And I think if I had had someone, if we take that out, other than that, I'd say, generally speaking, I enjoyed my time at UVA. But if I had had someone who would have said, hey, if you go to UVA, you can go to UVA, but if you go to UVA, this is what you might encounter, then I just would have been better mentally prepared to face those obstacles, rather than if let's say I wasn't at the top of my class student and had somehow made it into the university and I'm already combating learning curve and all of these additional things. And then I have that, so then I have racism, and then I've got, you know, like, I think just the programs are really different. I'll say really quickly, and then Lauren, I promise I'll be quiet.
No, please.
But
we have you here because we want your opinion.
The schools are different, and you know, there are schools like University of Cincinnati is known to be a great school if you want to co-op, you know, and start to build some of that experience. I'll tell you that I went to the University of Virginia, and in Architecture 101, I sat down in the class. I was given a Ziploc bag, 2 pistachio seeds, an index card, and some paper clips, and told to diagram the lawn. So I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is not, I had worked in architecture a little bit, and so I thought, this is not architecture. This is not what I know it to be. But that program is fairly theoretical. And so I got a lot of pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope, which is fine. I'm not really actually critiquing the school in of itself. I'm just saying it would have been nice to kind of know, like, if you go here, you're going to get this. If I would have gone to Virginia Tech, I would have gotten a more technical approach. If I had gone to Hampton, I would have gotten the HBCU experience. And so, but I didn't know any of that. I just said, oh, I want to go. I got accepted to the University of Virginia, and I went there, you know.
So talking about the university experience and what the future is, Michael Armstrong from NCARB put out an article 2 weeks ago about the future of architecture education is the IPAL program. So we spoke a little bit about the IPAL program when we talked about architectural education with the Dean of NJIT. And we've since kind of brought that back over and over again. And we've already got questions in that chat box of IPAL being the future of architecture education. Let's ask Kendall what you think of the IPAL program, and do you think that it plays a role in the future of architecture education?
So I'd say on the surface, I commend IPAL for what it's trying to do and expedite the amount of time that it takes to get to licensure, right? Like, it takes, I think the most recent statistic was 12.7 years after high school graduation. So you're talking about roughly the same amount of time as it takes to become a physician. And one of my biggest gripes with architecture in particular is that it requires you it's hard, as I think William said. It's hard, and so it requires you to do all of these things and accomplish and prove so many times that you can stick with it, but you don't have the physician's salary or the attorney's salary, you know, so you have to do all of the same kinds of things, but the outcome is not quite the same as far as, minimizing the wealth gap. When I think about IPAL, I think, as I understand it, there are a number of programs, and I talk to the people at NCARB a lot, and they're great people. But there's always another application. It's not typically something that's adapted in full, right? So you need to get into the school, and then you need to get into the IPAL program. So that's another obstacle that could potentially be eradicated. I don't think IPAL solves all of the issues of licensure. I think it's a nice point of access, but on the whole, we have a lot of access to the profession. I might even argue, controversially, that we have too many. Like, it's really hard to figure out. You got the B arc, the M arc, the D arc, you have post-professional degrees, you've got the pre-professional degrees. For a student that is just trying to go to architecture in hopes of getting licensed, like there are so many different ways in which you can do it. And so you might end up at a school that has IPAL, and that might help you. You might end up at a school that doesn't have it. It gets really complicated really quickly.
So we did reach out on social media to people and ask them what their experience was. And in particular, I was trying to reach out to people who are in the IPAL program. I got very little response because there aren't very many people, to be perfectly honest. But of the ones that did respond, the one criticism they had was you just have to take the test. You don't have to pass the test. So is that a flaw of the IPAL program, that it's not really preparing you to do everything as promised? It's just preparing you to check off the boxes and say, you know, we did all these steps, but you're still out there on your own. Whereas we did have a lengthy discussion from our colleagues in the law profession who did enact I want to call it a law, but it's more probably a regulation that said if you do not pass the bar within 2 years of graduating an accredited law school, that if too many of you do that, then the law school is in danger of losing their accreditation. Put the responsibility back into the system and not keep blaming the candidate for their constant failure. In a systemic problem, it's the system that needs to be changed. The candidate didn't simply not want it bad enough. Does anybody have any comments on that? Do you think that the NCARB is right when they say that the candidate just didn't want it bad enough?
I don't know. I think when you take the exam, once you get into that process, and I've mentored young people, you know, young interns taking the exam, and they're geared toward passing the exam to become an architect. They know what it means to study, to gain knowledge of the material, to get it done. But I think I just wrote in the chat that one thing with IPAL maybe that could happen, I've been hearing this talk for a number of years, is professional practice as curriculum as part of schools of architecture. I mean, if we put professional practice as a real stable and substantial thing in a school of architecture, and you know, put a component of that with licensure, I think we'll be getting on par with those other professions, such as the medical profession, the law profession, to say that as these students are coming out of school, they are going toward the right path to take their licensure as an architect, to pass the exam, and to be a productive part of the profession. That's just my point on it.
Do you think the NAB accredited degrees need to take more responsibility for the architecture and less off the firms to be teaching students what they need to teach to be good architects and licensed professionals?
Let me say a few things, because I think that's a great question. I did a research study that you can also find on the website. I need to put some of these links here. On the ACSA website, we did a 2-part research study with NCARB. First, surveying the professional practice courses, reading syllabi, understanding who was teaching it, what the typical content was. And then the second part, we surveyed practitioners, typically firm leaders, and recent hires and new grads. So some people that had 0 to 2 years of full-time work experience. To try to figure out, there seems to be this idea in the profession that new grads don't have all the skills that they should have to enter the profession. But at the same time, the profession will say, they recognize, like firm leaders often will say, I didn't learn much of what I know about professional practice until 10 years in, right? Like, so there's this dichotomy, this contradiction of like, our students need to know more so they can do more when they get here, but it took me 10 years to actually know enough of what I know. And so that was the purpose of that study, and I'll try to find the link after I stop talking and put it in the chat here. But Lauren, your question was about was about,
Should
remind me your
the
question.
should the NAB accredited degree take on more of the responsibility of educating candidates rather than the firms through the AXP?
Right. So I think one of the things that, again, if I circle this back to my discussion or comments about social relevancy, is one of the things that continues to get me is the lack of desire to have a definition of architecture. As I talk about the diversity of programs, part of that is it's beautiful in that programs are diverse and no two schools are the same, right? There's artistry in that. But it's problematic because you go to med school to become a physician, right? Or a physician's assistant. There's like a very specific thing you're trying to accomplish. And you go to law school, in most cases, to become an attorney. In architecture school, the idea is that you go to architecture school to change the built environment and change the world, right? And that's beautiful. I can get with that, but on the same token, we have to at some point say we're trying to create architects. Like that's what our job is. And if someone decides that they don't want to do that and they decide to affect the built environment in a different way, that's fine. But the main goal here is to develop practicing architects. And right now, the discipline is not willing to say that.
And in reality, and that's a great point, from my side of the table, we get different candidates from different schools, and we tend to gravitate to schools that do provide sort of professional ready candidates because it's important to us. And so, I went to Syracuse University, and, they didn't provide me with the things that I thought students should have. And the only difference between me and other students was I had a father who was practicing in architecture, and I sort of understood it. I was around it all the time, as I said earlier. But from the standpoint of hiring people, I do want to hire people that are have a leg up in terms of the profession. They understand what it's about. And, those individuals that come into our firm that are better prepared get jobs, and they, we put them to work and we mentor them and all those things. So I think that that's an important component of this.
So
I went to Howard University, and when I came, it was a more practical education that I received. When I graduated, I could put a building together. So we were taught that. We have professional practice. I'm a strong proponent of IPAL, and I'm trying to study now what are some of the deficiencies, or how can we make this work. But I think this is a good vehicle, and I want to see how the architectural community can help step in and help some of the candidates. If they can't get the necessary hours in their own firm, how can the architectural community step up and help these young candidates for licensure? So I'm looking at that, trying to study that now.
So
I
we
also
did talk.
think that colleges have a motivation to meet certain educational criteria because that's how they maintain their NAAB accreditation. Once a graduate is out working in a firm, even though there is a structure put out by the AXP program, the firms aren't necessarily motivated to move their employees through that. So like if you look at the financial industry where we have the firm having courses for the Series 3 and the Series 7, they're working on it at lunchtime or they're working on it after work together. So there's an assigned member of the staff that's helping to get everybody moving along. You don't see that same structure in most architecture firms. The firm isn't necessarily motivated to do anything more than check off a box that the time was put in, but not necessarily being held to a certain standard for the quality of what that experience is. And I don't know that we could do that for all the different sizes of firms that we have across the country. And, you know, I mean, look how long IDP has been in place, and AXP, and each new version, and the improvements that we try to make. And even all the things that Will said. I mean, sometimes you say, gee, every one of us on this call is a knucklehead who would become an architect instead of a construction manager. What the heck why are we encouraging anyone to do this? We should all be out developing buildings. So, you know, I mean, there are a lot of elements of the system that are dysfunctional for everyone. So when you layer on top of that, not having a role model, dealing with systemic racism, dealing with finding the balance that you need to be able to maintain your financial support of your family. You know, it's a complicated problem even for the rich white classic person who has no barriers. It's a complicated process to begin with. So it's, you know, architecture has a lot of elements that make it difficult for even the person who has every handicap made available to them. So it's tricky one. It's a very hard one to answer.
So we did talk to the dean of Princeton last panel, and she mentioned a couple of things. And we did talk a great deal about IDP. But basically, her answer is that AXP needs to disappear. It's based on what she described to be Jim Crow laws. It doesn't allow for any kind of equality in offering of opportunity, right? Even as Stacy put it, even if you were a rich white person, firm to firm, you're not offered the same educational experience. You're not offered the same opportunities, which means that when you approach ARE, if this is an experiential test, if we're not all receiving even a remotely similar experience, how is that test fair when you're talking about testing minimum competency? If there's no organization and there's no regulation and there's no checklist of what a student is supposed to learn in the AXP other than checking the box in the 37-40 hours, how can you say that an experiential test is the appropriate way to determine minimum competency? And the last point I'm going to make that she made, and that we're going to talk a little bit more about, is that a system based on getting your employer to offer you opportunities is a system that really is probably not ethical and maybe not legal, because you're stopping someone's financial opportunity, which means you're stopping their income because you're giving them a lack of opportunity, whether it's conscious or unconscious. What do you think of these things?
I do think it would be interesting to have somebody kind of model that test, that environment that she suggested, and see what it produces. You know, one of the challenges that we always have is that a lot of the dialogue is based on assumptions or anecdotal things that we don't necessarily know for a fact are the issue. We know that there's an issue, but we don't know exactly where it's occurring. So I thought it would, even though it was a provocative suggestion that she made, I did find it very interesting, and I was curious how we could kind of model that and see what the outcome of that kind of environment could be, because I do think it is a very real issue for people to be able to go through and get that practical experience. I think the idea behind IDP and AXP and the way that we describe it is that, okay, you have this list, you can say to your employer, instead of in a pre-IDP day where you have to kind of go and ask for experience, you can now say, look, there's this checklist I have, can you make sure, help me get these categories? And it's supposed to And the idea is supposed to empower and enable you to be able to go and ask for those experiences. But the reality is that, you know, even with that checklist, it can be very difficult for someone to go and ask for those experiences. And it may just very frankly be difficult for a firm to even offer those experiences depending on the type of firm that they are. So, you know, I do think that the idea that you proposed is a very interesting one, and it would be great if there was a way to kind of model it and see what that outcome would produce instead.
It's very interesting because you know, I think about the profession and I think about the history of profession, and so much about the profession is rooted in a profession that is described as an old man's profession, right? So people that are in architecture, you know, you don't reach your prime allegedly until, you know, you're in your twilight years in architecture, and that causes problems in some respects, because I think the whole structure of becoming an architect is about, you know, spending this inordinate amount of time going through an apprenticeship to become an architect, and then over years and many years, you eventually become a good architect, right? And so I think, you know, the program of you know, the word apprenticeship and what you're expected to do, you know, through the, you know, through NCARB and AXP IDP is a vestige of that. And you really start to wonder why, where did it come from? And once I think we understand where it came from and why you're forced to kind of go through this system, then you can start to address, then what is the need for these different things? What is the need for these obstacles to be in place? Because in many respects, it's tied to the history of architecture and the apprenticeship program and what you need to do in order to become an architect.
Yeah, Vince, I just want to go on that point. So I remember taking my exam pre-IDP, which means I had to apprentice for 3 years, get signatures from either the principal in my firm or the architect I'm working with in my firm, and I was able to sit for the exam. Going back to Bill Brown's point, you know, I went to Pratt, and I think Pratt taught us to be very practical, but then, you know, the profession or the practice of architecture, it didn't teach all the nuances of what that was. So, you know, getting through the exam, and the exam back then is not what we have now, which is you have this ongoing exam. You can sign up, take it, take a part, pass it, get everything done in a couple of years. The exams back then were only offered twice a year. And I think at one point they only offered parts of the written exam one type of the year, and then they offered the graphic portions one type of year. So you had to make sure you ready for those two parts of the year and get yourself prepared, and hopefully you pass, because you had to wait an entire year to take it again. And the pressure of that, and also to, I think back then too, the costs were a bit lower. Okay, yes, we were doing pencil and paper. You brought your drafting kit, you brought your drafting board. It's a lot different now, but compared to what I see talking to my mentees, you know, what they're spending in books, exam fees, when they don't pass the exam, how they have to pay again, there has to be incentives. And I think going to Will Moses's point, you know, when you're trying to really get to this profession, and just going to your point again, Vince, I mean, you said it's an old man's profession, but I know coming up when I was in Pratt and coming through college, I look at that as a white man's profession, because it was hard for me. It was hard for me to kind of get to where I had to get to, because it's like, look, I was working, I had to pay part of my way through school to make it. So, you know, I think incentives are needed in the schools and also in the profession. And like I said before, architects should somehow try to help subsidize or put something back into the pot. I mean, a good point is, like, you know, when I left Pratt, one of my grade advisors asked me to come back and teach. I was working. I mean, I was working. I was young. I didn't want to do it. But I said, you know what? Why don't I give back? You know, and I taught at Pratt for 5 years, and I did that because I gave back. And if every architect could think of giving back somehow to the profession to help do AXP, to help to this process, to help maybe with the schools of architecture, I think would be something that would benefit us and make us better architects down the road.
Yeah. it's a brutal profession on so many points. It really is.
So is it brutal because it needs to be, or is it brutal because of the system?
It's brutal because of all the things that Dr. Nicholson talked about. And it's also brutal when you take that off the table, and I'm not suggesting in this panel that we take it off the table, but what Stacy talked about is true too, right? For somebody who has means and doesn't have obstacles, it's still a brutal profession. You know, when I was, you know, when we were all in school going through architecture, and this idea that you had to kill yourself in studio over many hours, I just never really got. You know, I just never really understood. Why is that? Why do I have to go through physical endurance of like an endurance test in order to be an architect? Why do I have to do that? And it's kind of ingrained culturally in the architectural profession that you have to do these things in order to become an architect. And you know, the apprenticeship program and IDP, AXP, that's all kind of what systematically is wrong with architecture in many respects. It makes it very tough.
There's also a lot of subjective criticism, right? Like that was always the part that I never quite understood. Maybe it's because I was a mathematician first that I was like, I can do this and get a right answer. And someone, you know, a professor would say, well, no, like that's not, you're not quite there yet, keep working. Well, who, you know, as a student, I often attempted to define my own parameters for what my success was. And I think all too often, and I'm speaking, I'm not speaking necessarily with my equity hat on, I'm speaking about my own experience. All too often, project types, pedagogical practices are so focused on the building, being the artifact, and the environment that sometimes we miss the people, right? Like the people who interact with the building are the afterthought. As long as the building is sound and beautiful and it respects the environment, then you can get an A. And you put the people in your renderings, right? You know, but I think for me that wasn't necessarily my criteria, and so I found myself always challenging the system as someone who came from a fairly privileged background, challenging the system to try to make the program what it is I wanted it to be. And I'll just kind of stop there. But I think it's brutal largely because there's a lot of subjectivity in there, where there's this passage of knowledge from professor to student, from architect to recent hire, and it's only supposed to go one way.
I just recall all the people who didn't make it through the program because it's tough on so many levels, and a lot of them were far more talented than me. And you know, it's a shame. And there's probably people who are on, you know, this Zoom seminar that are struggling and may drop off because, you know, for all the reasons that we've talked about, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
So what do you believe, each of you, because I'm going to ask each of you, what do you think is the best way to either fix the system we already have or create a new system? Or what do you believe is the best way to pull people through it so that we do have more people in the future of our industry? I'll start with Bill.
Don't me.
Will
Moses.
Moses.
Yeah, I will.
I don't believe there's a way to fix the existing system. I think the way how the existing system is set up in a way where like you said earlier about that comment from NCARB, if you don't want it hard enough, then you won't be able to get it if you don't want it as hard enough. So I believe the existing set up that in that way, and the premises, set up in a way that you gotta do this rigorous way of studying and going about architecture, and the whole thought of being an architect set up that way. And I, for instance, think that, maybe there should be some way to maybe reconstruct the whole system. I believe that, like when I started architecture, I felt as though like I didn't have the means or ability to, once confronted with all of my peers, most of my peers, they either had parents in architecture or uncles, or they had someone in construction, or they sort of had some sort of leg up. And I felt as though maybe I was a little behind, what I'm saying? But so I felt as though that it's it's part of the system that sort of sets you back. And, you want to be able to get out, graduate, get money, and be sustainable in the career. And when you find yourself not doing exams when you get out of school because you want to try to work in the field and get money. So personally, I just think that the system needs to be revamped. Either we could just trash the whole system and start anew, and this way it can go with the projection of okay, this is what an architect really does. This is what being an architecture really means, and this is the steps that we can take as a new person starting in this career. How can you be better than the next person? How you can be better than what we have going on now in this age of architecture?
So Andrew, same question.
I think the system needs interventions and changes in parts of the system to make it a lot better than what it is today. I think also giving incentives for architects to do the right thing, So for example, mentorship. I mean, we all take our CEUs every year. We gotta put in for our CEUs to get our credits renewed and get our license renewed. Why not, as part of those CEUs, you put in for mentorship? You mentor some young kid, or or a kid in a community that can't maybe get access to architecture, or you go to a school like myself and John Found did with the city of Newark, and you put the time in there, every week after work, and get units for that, and that goes toward your renewals, or maybe even give you some incentives coming back. Diversity in the schools, I think, is also a big issue. I think every school, for what architects need to do in communities around the country, and also globally, we should start representing that in our schools. And I mean, I'm going to give the example of what happened at Pratt. If somebody can dump $1 million, this is the former head of American Express, why would he dump $1 million into the program for diversity in the School of Architecture at Pratt Institute? Either the person who had him do that was very good at steering that money toward there, but there are a lot of folks who are the 1% and 2% in this country who can do the same thing. I think Bill Gates with his foundations and Jeff Bezos with all the money that he has can put this money into, how do they build their warehouses and their buildings and their office space? They need architects, but to bring it back from the beginning. So that's number two. And for schools of architecture, for the curriculum, I understand, look, I mean, I didn't come from the traditional route. I mean, I have a 2-year engineering degree because I couldn't afford architecture right out of high school. So I got a 2-year engineering degree. I worked for a year, saved up all my tuition, and I got accepted into Pratt, and I did my 5 years at Pratt. Some students take that non-traditional path to get through schools of architecture, but even so, give them incentives either in some sort of financial, sort of piece, or like what they're trying to do now with some schools, community schools, is make the school free. Make certain schools to the path of architecture free, take that burden off that student, and make them know that they don't have that, like you said, Vince, that brutal path you have to take in front of you. You take those interventions in the system, we will see the 2% we're always talking about that I've been seeing for the last 15 years start to go up. And I'll leave it at that.
I want to just say that some people in the chat and I also agree that I think you might have stumbled on a really brilliant idea. If you offer member firms HSW credits for teaching candidates, and the candidate has to sign off on those hours the same way the firm owner has to sign off on the candidate's hours, I think we might have a really interesting idea on how to better have the firm members teaching students instead of just signing off on hours.
Yeah.
Lorianne, same question.
I think that I don't know whether the system needs to be revamped or just kind of built anew, but I do think that a key part of it is making stronger linkages between each of the parts, kind of along the lines that Andrew was saying, tying firms to mentorship, I think tying schools, as we talked about, to exam success. I think making all of those things better integrated, and also eliminating the kind of series of shocks that people go through along the path. I don't think we're trying to lower the bar enough that anybody could be an architect, but I do think for the people who are interested in becoming architects, that we're finding ways to make sure that path is just not one that's a series of hazing routines, but one that's really about enriching them to be the best professionals that they can be along the way. And perhaps not being so obsessed as we are right now with the order in some cases. There's some jurisdictions where you have to do it in that order. You have to wait before you do the next piece. I think getting to the point where all of this is part of an integrated system, that you're getting at the very base of it, the pieces that you need, design as a base, practical experience on being a professional, and then even just that community piece of giving back to the profession, the community, all of society together. We need better linkages between those things as part of the process to become an architect.
Vince?
Okay, so this has really been an interesting conversation, and I'll start by saying I describe my own profession I love as being brutal, but it's also one that I love, but there are aspects of it that I don't like, and that I consider to be, having gone through it, even with the advantages that I had, I felt were just rooted in a lot of unnecessary steps to become an architect. And in my ideal world, I would think that if you go to school and you graduate from the School of Architecture, then you should be able to get access to the exam, because the exam is the common denominator. And you should be able to take your exam and move along in that process. And I think if you explain all the steps that have to happen and all the obstacles that exist and all the different, the sort of diversity in terms of the different levels of education and how that ties into when and how you can move up the ladder, I just think it doesn't create an environment for people to achieve success in this profession. And I'm encouraged by certainly what Andrew said about linking architects to CEUs and getting credit for mentoring. I think that's a fantastic idea in my opinion. So I don't know that sort of throwing out the system is the right idea, because we do have, the bar, and that is, in other words, if you explain to somebody very clearly that if you want to become an architect, this is what you do. And being able to articulate that very clearly and have it be a pathway that makes sense. Right now, in my opinion, it doesn't. I'm not sure exactly how to address it all. I'm sort of tackling a small part of that world, and that is, as I talked about earlier, with helping students learn more about it. I think the profession doesn't do a really good job at explaining what architecture is. And, you know, time and time again, I run into professionals that, that if they're not in an allied profession with architects or understand exactly what I do, it's really interesting the types of descriptions I get from very educated people about what architects do. And I think somehow or another we're missing the big picture, in my opinion, on many fronts, and that being one of them.
Kendall.
Thanks. So I wrote down a few things so I wouldn't forget. One of the things that I think is important is to eradicate the necessity, specifically for people of color, to be exceptional, right? Like architecture breeds this exceptionalism idea. And so Lorianne said, you know, that it's not that we want to create it so that, you know, anybody just walking off the street can become an architect. But it shouldn't require that you be so exceptional in myriad, you know, facets to be able to make it to the end, right? It should be an attainable goal for the average average college educated person. Secondly, I think curricular changes. So I think all schools need to implement or adopt an abolitionist, anti-racist pedagogy that validates student experiences. That's one of the things I talk about. I am currently serving as the Goff Chair for Creative Architecture at the University of Oklahoma, and training faculty there, but really under the idea that everyone, whether they are white, Black, Indigenous, a person of color, Latinx, you know, Asian, that everyone has some prior experience and has something to contribute. And so what happens in architecture, what happens in school in general, but I know it happens in architecture, is this idea that the prior experience that you bring sometimes as a person of color is not validated or not even useful. So I'll give the example of the numerous programs we had of museums and hotels and wonderful things that allow you to play with design. But often, I'm not going to say often, but sometimes put me at a disadvantage to my peers. Whereas how interesting might it have been if our program, even one time, was a historically Black church, right? Like my understanding of that space is in my case would have been drastically better than my peers. And so instead of having the leg down, I would have had the leg up, and rectifying that as one piece. The other thing that was circling around, so in July of last year, I, along with a number of people, attended the NAB's AR Forum. And one of the things that came up is the idea of licensure at is architect at graduation, right? So the idea that maybe you graduate and you become an architect, and that licensure is this additional piece that could come, could be modified still, but could come later, right? Like right now, you can't even use that term. You can go through the 5 years, you can, you know, go through the co-op program, but you can't even use that term until you have jumped the hurdle, you know, 7 times. And then I just want to call attention to some of the work done, like Andrew was talking about Pratt, which is currently led by Harriet Harris, the dean there. And I think Andrew also mentioned Leslie Loco, who just resigned from City College. And those are just 2 examples of people who are really trying to look at the curriculum, make changes that push in a way that is vocal to people that I know fairly well. And you can see that they encounter different obstacles on their journey to rectify architectural education. So I think there's an entire awakening or reckoning, so to speak, that the nation has to have for the profession and the schools to follow suit or be able to do what it is they like to do.
So Bill, I'm gonna give you the opportunity to ask the same or answer the same question.
I think the education system needs to be restructured and cutting down the years that are required for an architect to become licensed. You know, as far as when you graduate college and you start working, a lot of times you have different life experiences and they get in the way, and it's very difficult. So I would like to see the educational system be restructured and have like the aspects of AXP be incorporated in the curriculum so that the kids can take the exam upon graduation. I think that will be bring some type of equity into the profession. And make sure the kids take some business courses. You know, it's not really, you know, offered in many of the schools, but I would like to see that being offered in the curriculum of architecture, some type of business courses. But the one of the things I was finding that with iPal is that kids are not getting the practical education. That was an issue. They're getting the amount of hours in practical education and a practical experience. And that's why I see the architectural profession, the community step up and help these candidates for licensure in their hours of gaining experience and practical knowledge about architecture. So I think we as architects could play a major role in that, and mentoring not only the college students, but start young is very important. I had kids like in third, fourth grade, they never saw a Black architect before, you know. But I think it's important that kids be exposed to, all kids be exposed to what we do, and that we're want to encourage them to consider architecture as a profession. So I think we got to start young, talking to the kids, inspiring them, encouraging them. You'd be amazed at some of these kids, some of the IT ideas that they have. They're very creative, but you just gotta show them some love, encourage them, and so that they can have a room to grow. But I just think the college education the system has to be restructured, and I would like to see the graduates take the exam upon graduation to cut down the number of years.
Okay. Thank you. Stacy, last but certainly not least.
Thank you, Lauren. I think that because there are so many steps in this process from elementary and secondary education, what exposure is design education given in our young people, and do they have a respect for the value of design in their communities? Then number two, what our students are going through in the university, and that bridge between that you had mentioned, what guidance are students getting from high school to be able to connect to what's going on in college? And then what does the internship stage look like? What does the exam stage look like? What is your continuing education experience? Each one of these sectors of the path to licensure and beyond is overseen by a separate entity. And I see AIA being in a unique position where our members experience every single one of those stages. So I wouldn't expect somebody from NAAB to be well-versed in what's going on in an internship. I wouldn't expect someone from NCARB to be well-versed in what's going on in design education for elementary school children. But AIA has the ability to create an overarching connection between all of these other entities. And we know we have the 6 organizations that do meet and discuss these things. And I would hope that AIA would take more responsibility to try to look at the connections of all of these elements and make sure that there is a smooth relationship between each of them. Because I don't think any one of those separate entities that handle a sector of it can inform the big picture the way the representatives from AIA can. So I first of all want to applaud everybody on this call for the contributions that you make in your professional life and your personal life to solving this problem. And to Lauren for taking on the challenge of putting together this webinar series. It was like, you know, a light bulb went off. The next day she had the series in place. The dates were on the calendar, and she's been collecting brilliant minds like all of you on today's call for us to be able to have these conversations. And I hope that we will continue these conversations outside of the webinar series, and that we will learn from what we've talked about today and find new ways to solve these problems on a personal scale with what we each can do as an individual, on a statewide scale, and then on a professional scale, so that we can try to solve these problems and the next generation won't have to go through them. The things we're talking about tonight have been problems since the beginning of, you know, any kind of professional oversight for this profession. And, you know, it's been a very, very slow process to make progress. And I hope we can speed that up, because everything else in our lives is whirling around in a lightning flash. And here we are still trudging along trying to fix these things. So I think we're heading in the right direction. I think AIA has a lot of power and can, you know, drag everyone to the table and hammer these things out. And I hope they will take some opportunity to do that, lead the conversation, and make sure the conversation gets to a point where the problem is solved.
Well, thank you for those kind words too. It has been a pleasure for me to put these panels together. I've met so many new people and learned so much. So we do have a little bit of time left. So I'm going to leave that time for the future of who's already in the profession. So we talked a lot about getting more people to be licensed architects. Let's talk about the ones that are already here. How do we best support, well, this panel is about people of color. So how do we best support the people of color who are already in the profession? Either ones that are squeaking through ARE, or the ones that are in mid-level management that, you know, we need to see more people of color in leadership, more people of color on licensing boards, more people of color at the executive level of AIA. What do you think we can do to support more people at the higher levels of the industry?
I think one quick thing is I was doing research today about the wage gap. For Blacks in America, they make like 67 cents on every dollar that I guess they make 67% less than the average in median household income. So I think the average median household income is $68,000, and for Blacks it's like 46, something like that. So I would say to pay more. The wealth gap is real. I would say reparations, but that's a whole nother long discussion. So I would say to pay more, and maybe to prioritize projects that impact the community directly.
What I would say, Lauren, is don't let who you are be an obstacle to yourself. You know, a lot of sometimes Black people think that, oh, because I'm Black, I'm never going to get this way, or I'm never going to move forward in this path, or I'm never going to get that position. That's nonsense. You have to remember that as a people, as human beings, we all have the same biological makeup. We may have different skin colors, different hair textures, but we can all achieve the same thing. So when I talk to my mentees, I tell them, as long as you have it in you, the passion for architecture and what you want to do, you can achieve it. And for the most part, I keep drilling that in them, and they get there. They don't look at their color as the obstacle that I can achieve. And so that's how I live my life. I mean, I live my life that I've been Black all my life. I know that. But I also live my life to know that I want to get to the highest level that I can. And so when I talk to those kids in the schools I tell them, I said, look, don't look at what's out the window define you. Look at what's, up in the sky and say, that's where you want to go. That's kind of the advice I have.
So for Lori, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, for me, I always say, you have to find your passion. You got to find your niche in life. You find your passion and an opportunity. You create a niche, and you can make a difference in the world. You got to think globally, think beyond yourself to make a difference. And the line I always give to the students that I mentor is that you strive for excellence and never make peace with mediocrity. So I always stress that, and I'm proud of who I am and where I've been and where I'm going. So we have a lot of integrity. We have a lot of knowledge as a people, and we can achieve great things and make great contributions to not only our local communities, but throughout the world. So we as architects can be very influential in our communities about the knowledge that we have, and be able to share and make a difference. And it takes teamwork. That's one thing that we can, working with young people, get them to try to work in teams to share knowledge. I always say that each of us our fingerprints are different. We have something to contribute. We have different experiences, different backgrounds. So we bring a lot of things to the table. So people can share, we can work together to make a difference in the world.
So for Vince and Lorianne, who work together, Vincent, at one point you will retire. Do you have a system in place to bring up someone to be part of your leadership?
Absolutely. And, it's a work in progress, but I know that I personally, I care about that because we want to have the legacy of the firm continue, and we want to have it be what it is, which is, a great MBE firm that has its roots in part back to my father and what he started. And so I was the beneficiary of that, and I want to continue that with people like Lorianne and others in the firm.
How about William or Kendall? Any words about people who are already licensed? I know, Will, you're still on your road to licensure, as am I. So I know that this is fresh for us.
Well, I think maybe let them know that it's possible, because, coming up in the profession, I didn't think I would be able to maybe become a partner in the firm or be an associate in the firm, because I just don't see these type of people that look like me doing these things. And sometimes maybe just letting them know that it's possible. And, in terms of the firms, what we were working on at Gensler was we were working on a path to associate or having the architects into a more managerial role. So we're working on that at a large level. And I'm sure that many other firms will probably follow suit, eventually once we get it going, I'm sure firms will probably follow suit. But letting them know that it's possible, making sure that there's programs that are in place that can make that happen and have them achieve the support that they need to progress and to grow, and to not only just become an architect, but also go beyond, and be a lighting force for your community as well.
So when we asked NCARB how to get more people of color into their programs, whether it's volunteer test writers or board members, the one thing they wanted to stress to us is that their member boards are based on the Board of Licensure. So we need to make sure that the one thing that we do is get the governor of every state to make sure that they are appointing people of color to those licensing boards, so that there is that perspective at NCARB to make these changes at that level. And of course, at the level of being on zoning boards, to be able to actually enact the regulations in their communities. So I want to make sure that I leave you all with that. So be the change that you want to see. And since Kendall, you are our guest today, I'll leave you with the final thoughts for the night. And then I will thank everyone.
Well, I'll just say really quickly as it's time to wrap up. One, I'll say I appreciate you all inviting me and allowing me to share this space. But two, I think even though the systems are prominent and dominant, much of what I've heard, I'll echo that we all play a part, right? So if you're not doing something that is anti-racist, then you're just going with the flow of racism, which is like smog in the air. And I'll leave everybody with that as something to think about. But really, that we all play a part. It requires everybody doing something to make the systemic change.
So thank you so much. And as Stacy said earlier, we really sincerely, especially at AIA New Jersey, think that this is just the beginning of a long conversation. So for everyone who had questions on the 12 or the 12 weeks of panels that didn't get them answered, make sure you reach out to us, because we do want to hear from you. If you want to be part of these solutions, reach out to us, because we want to hear all of your ideas, because I sincerely believe that the idea to fix the system is going to come from the most unusual source. So if we don't listen to every idea, we'll miss it. So I want to thank each of you, Will and Andrew and Lorianne and Vince and Stacy and Bill and Kendall, and all the panelists from the last 12 weeks. This has been a really important series of panels, and I think that our audience appreciates it. So thank you so much, and have a great night. Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Lauren,
Bye.
appreciate you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.